Over the last few years, I've gotten heavily into board games and run a weekly board game night with friends and family. We usually play strategy games, and our group has all decided that Dune Imperium is our favourite. After dozens of playthroughs, we find ourselves never tiring of it and are always eager to play it again and again. I even love it so much that I occasionally play it online with random people through Tabletop Simulator, for which there's a huge and active online community. I also love watching strategy guides and match commentaries on YouTube, such as on the Hidden Assets YouTube channel, from where I got the footage for this video. In this essay, I'll explore what exactly it is about Dune Imperium that makes it such an incredible board game. Dune Imperium has 3 overlapping systems: deck building, worker placement, and combat. Players begin with a starter deck of cards that each have certain board access, agent effects, reveal effects, and combat strength. Players can only place their workers, which are called agents, on the board spaces when they play a card with the corresponding symbol from their hand. And if the card being used has an agent effect, the player will gain a bonus. After completing these worker placement turns, or the agent turns, players then strengthen their decks by acquiring a new card once per round in the reveal turn. These new Imperium cards provide access to valuable locations on the board, or they provide powerful agent or reveal effects. Purchasing new cards changes the viability of certain board spaces, as a card with a powerful effect may only be playable on a particular type of space, such as a city space or on the Emperor track. These agent turns can either improve or harm your ability to acquire new cards. For example, if I play this Arrakis Liaison as an agent, I cannot reveal it for the 2 persuasion, which is used to purchase cards. However, if I play this dagger onto tech negotiation, I actually gain a persuasion, or instead I can draw additional cards from going to research station. The worker placement and deck building systems also are deeply connected with combat. Sending agents to certain board spaces allows troops to be recruited and/or deployed to the combat zone. New Imperium cards can also bolster your combat strength. Some give you free troops, while others reveal for several swords. At the end of each round, players engage in combat and fight for first, second, and third place rewards. Combat rewards are not just victory points in isolation, but can be various bonuses such as resources, faction influences, or a bump on the shipping track. These bonuses can then shape how you play in the following turns. Some combat rewards also help with the deck building aspect of the game, as it gives you a trash action, which you can use to get rid of one of those weak starter cards. All of these systems in Dune Imperium interact elegantly, and no part feels separate. Throughout a game of Dune Imperium, players then lean more heavily into these foundational elements of the game. Players can purchase the Swordmaster, a High Council seat, and Dreadnoughts, which grant bonuses to worker placement, deck building, and combat respectively. Dune Imperium benefits from the combination of these 3 systems. It has the strategy of worker placement, the satisfaction of deck building, and the tactics and the excitement of player versus player combat. The combination of economy and combat is also reminiscent of the RTS games that I love so much and which I cover on this YouTube channel. Dune Imperium has the best combat of any board game that I've played. Above all, participation in combat is always voluntary. You can only enter the combat by deploying troops from your garrison to the battlefield, and this means that there's no frustrating surprise of suddenly getting attacked in a way that you didn't see coming. This can happen in other board games, including ones that I quite like, such as Scythe. So not having this random surprise attack, it can be really beneficial to new players, or even just to players who don't like those kind of games and find them a little stressful. However, experienced players can still get an edge in combat by reading into their opponent's resources and their intentions based on what they've been doing throughout the round. Dune Imperium's combat is much less frustrating than those of some other board games. For example, in Rising Sun, small combat swings can be extremely punishing because the winner of the combat received the reward as well as keeping all of their troops. On the flip side, the loser of the combat loses their entire force and gets nothing from the combat. It's much more fair in Dune Imperium, where all troops, including those of the winner, are lost after a battle is resolved. Combat in Dune Imperium is typically won by whoever commits the most troops to a fight, which means that they're investing and losing the most resources. Additionally, the rewards for second and third place mitigate some of the frustration of having a combat win stolen away from you. You still have a consolidation prize. The second and third place combat rewards also encourage players to deploy small amounts of troops to the battlefield, and this makes combat always interesting and always contested by multiple players. It then also creates tension, because you don't know if a player is only looking for a second place, or if they're actually going to commit more troops and try to win the battle. Players can supplement their deployed troops by spending intrigue cards, or just revealing cards from their hand. I think Dune Imperium's combat is well balanced, because the bonus provided by these cards is relatively minor. An inexperienced player can just dump 10 troops into a battle and practically be guaranteed the win. But then more experienced players can expertly use cards to change the tide of tightly contested battles. Players are rewarded for keeping track of their deck and those of the other players. Advanced players can then decide when and how to commit to a battle by remembering which combat cards have been purchased and analysing the discard piles to see which cards are likely to be played. The combat in Dune Imperium encapsulates the elegance of the overall game design. It may seem simple at first, and it is very beginner friendly, but it also has a very high skill ceiling, and it provides a lot of depth to experienced players. Games of Dune Imperium tend to feel close, even when there's quite an experience gap. It can be quite disheartening in some other board games when the winner triples or doubles the score of the loser. But this rarely happens in Dune Imperium because there's many anti-snowball mechanics. As a result, a beginner may end a game with 7 victory points when the winner had 10 or 11, and this makes it feel as if they had a fighting chance. Most games of Dune Imperium are exciting and tense until the end. Players will feel like they have a chance of winning until all the hidden information is revealed. Additionally, the player who triggers the endgame by reaching 10 victory points often doesn't win the game. Players can overtake them by gaining more victory points during or at the end of the round. The anti-snowball mechanics of Dune Imperium are subtle. They're not overly punishing or contrived. For example, it's easy to get victory points from the faction friendships, but it's difficult to take and hold their alliances. Getting victory points usually requires spending resources, such as spending water to draw cards from Research Station, or to get extra troops from hardy warriors. These bonuses then don't carry over into the subsequent rounds. Players also gain a victory point when buying the Spice Must Flow, but these cards are then worthless and only serve to clog up your deck. Players can also target whoever is seen to be winning by trying to steal their alliance or trying to beat them in a combat. Despite these anti-snowball mechanics, Dune Imperium still has a strong sense of progression and escalation throughout the match. It starts off slow, but it ramps up over time with each subsequent round. Throughout the game, players acquire a stronger deck. They participate in bigger combats with better rewards. They spend resources to go on more powerful board spaces, and they gain more actions each round with the Swordmaster, and then play intrigue cards for additional benefits. Players usually gain several victory points in the final round, as they build up to secure multiple points in a single action. For example, I can play Selective Breeding to get the Bene Gesserit Alliance, while also drawing 2 bonus cards, which may let me get a Spice Must Flow. Dune Imperium prevents a player from snowballing ahead, but it also delivers a satisfying growth curve, and it ends with an exciting and climactic final round. Most board games can be placed on a spectrum of skill versus luck. Too much luck and a game can feel frustrating and not really have any strategy, but also too much skill means that the best player wins every time, and newer players will lose interest. Board games are more social than video games, so this skill-luck dichotomy is crucial. You're not playing with leaderboards and matchmaking online, you're playing with your friends and your family. Everyone needs to have a chance of winning, and so a little bit of luck is quite important. Dune Imperium does have a lot of luck, mainly to do with what cards you draw. But this luck isn't particularly frustrating because you can plan around it. Maybe you don't draw the cards that you need, but you can always go Mentat or Arakeen to draw extra cards. The cards in the Imperium row are also visible to all players at all times, and the luck of which cards you purchase are mitigated by always having access to the Arrakis Liaison, the Spice Must Flow, and Reclaimed Forces. Players also have to deal with other players sabotaging their strategy, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally. This can include players fighting in combats, contesting alliances, or just blocking the board spaces that they need. The limited worker placement slots and the card access requirements means that anticipating these problems is central to the game. Dune Imperium isn't about executing the perfect strategy. It's about the pivots and the reactions that players have to make when things don't go their way. These factors add tension to the game every time you draw a card, or when you watch in dread as your opponent considers their action, which may block your crucial board space. Dune Imperium has enough luck and chaos to force players to be flexible and keep the best players from always winning, but the luck is generally delivered in a way that feels fair and not overly frustrating. Dune Imperium has enormous replay value, and not just because of luck or random chaos. The vast replayability is due to a combination of factors, such as a large deck of Imperium cards which can heavily shape a player's strategy. For example, players may pursue a Bene Gesserit deck utilizing powerful card synergies, or they may focus on acquiring cards that aid them in combat. Additionally, there's many playable leaders, randomized combat rewards, intrigue cards, and the tech tiles which grant permanent bonuses. Even the 5 cards that players draw into their hand at the start of each round can heavily shape the trajectory of a match. Dune Imperium is different each time you play, because there's multiple paths to victory. Victory points come from a mix of combat rewards, faction friendships and alliances, intrigue, Imperium, and the Spice Must Flow cards. These things are not a single strategy. You can't put all your eggs in the one basket. Players must acquire points through various means. You have to be flexible in shifting your strategy based on what other players are doing and which cards are revealed. These different pathways mean that even if another player blocks an action, there's always something else viable to do. Another important spectrum in board games is the hidden versus public information. Hidden information helps generate tension, but too much can be chaotic and frustrating as you can't predict your opponent's actions. This is another dichotomy that Dune Imperium expertly balances. You can't see the cards in their hands of other players, so you can't assume which board spaces they'll have access to or which reveal bonuses they'll gain. You have to secure the most vital board spaces first and then consider options for the following actions, depending on what's likely to be left available. However, you are far from blind, because resources are easily countable, and the most powerful board spaces have costs. For example, if an opponent has 6 spice, you can predict that they'll go highliner and deploy several troops to the battlefield. The most powerful actions that players can take are not hidden surprises. You can also see how many troops each player has in their garrison, so you can get a good assessment of the overall combat potential of each player. Players also hold hidden intrigue cards, which provide a wide range of bonuses, such as resources, combat strength, special actions, or ways of acquiring victory points. These intrigue cards add flexibility to players' actions and are very exciting when revealed at the right time to seize a particular advantage. Intrigue cards are also generally difficult to acquire and usually only grant minor or situational bonuses, yet they can turn the tide of a close game. Though, personally, I think some of the intrigue cards are a little too powerful, and they can be quite frustrating, such as Corner the Market, which grants up to 2 endgame victory points for free by doing actions which already directly generate victory points. Nevertheless, mastery of Dune Imperium requires predicting the actions of other players, which requires making intuitions about the hidden information based on your opponent's actions, the current board space, and utilizing the open information such as resources in the player's discard piles. Navigating hidden information is an excellent way for a board game to have a high skill ceiling, because it doesn't front-load the complexity onto new players with potential actions and extensive rules. Something subtle that I really appreciate about Dune Imperium is the simplicity of its scoring. The game end is triggered when the first player reaches 10 victory points, which means that each victory point you acquire is a substantial 10% of the way towards victory. Each point feels like a gratifying milestone, unlike most Euro games that I've played, in which players might acquire 70 or 120 victory points. The smaller victory point count means that ties are very common, and players must be aware of how resources resolve ties and try to prepare for the endgame accordingly. Dune Imperium has a swift end. There's no complicated calculations, there's no need for pen and paper or complex mathematics to add up points. No recounts or double checking is required. There's an elegance and simplicity to Dune Imperium's scoring, giving it a swift and dramatic ending. In my opinion, Dune Imperium has the perfect length for a board game. It's short compared to many other Euro games that I've played, but it's still long enough that everyone is satisfied by the end. I found that a game of Dune Imperium takes 2 to 3 hours for a casual in-person game. Even though the footage that I'm using in this video is from online tournament matches, most of my experience with the game looks more like this. This 2 to 3 hour social length makes it perfect for a weekday night after work, whereas Dune Classic or Terraforming Mars are definitely not. On the other hand, playing online on Tabletop Simulator in a non-social context usually takes about an hour and a half, and this is a pretty good length for committing to an online game with strangers. The game length is also pretty consistent. Sometimes other board games end really abruptly and anticlimactically, and this can be quite frustrating as everyone feels that they were just one turn away from achieving something really important. Dune Imperium is ideal in that it's usually clear which round will be the last, but not who will be the winner. Dune Imperium benefits from excellent visual design, which simplifies the game for new players. Different resources are clearly represented with different shapes and colors. For example, water is a blue droplet, spice is an orange hexagon, and Solari is a grey circle. Spice and Solari also have nice stacks of 5, making it quick and easy to count your opponent's resources. The board spaces are also well designed. Desert spaces are represented as yellow triangles, city spaces are purple circles, and the Landsrad spaces are green pentagons. It's easy to look at the cards in your hand and match them to one of the board spaces. Likewise, it's easy to remember the draw card and trash card symbols because they're intuitive. These may be subtle design features, but are examples of the crisper design that help make the game more intuitive to play. The only counter-example is the unload feature. This mechanic introduced in Rise of Ix never ceases to confuse new players, as it did for me when I first played. The graphic design of the unload abilities could definitely have been better. Dune Imperium excellently incorporates the Dune world and theme into its gameplay. Though the Dune saga may not immediately evoke ideas of a worker placement deck building game, fans of Dune will appreciate how the board spaces and cards provide abilities and bonuses that reflect their role in the universe. For example, the Fremen provide water with still suits, while the Spacing Guild grants mobility via fold space. The leader abilities make sense as well. Leto Atreides gains faction influence due to his charismatic nature and popularity. Meanwhile, Paul can use his prescience to look at the top card of his deck. There's also more subtle elements of the Dune theme in the gameplay. Resources are scarce and hard to come by, especially water. Even things like acquiring, drawing, and trashing cards are limited compared to other deck building games. This means that every resource and every card matters. There's only 2 to 3 turns per round, and usually 6 to 8 rounds per game, so every turn matters. You can't afford to have bad throwaway turns like you would in Dominion. I'm a huge fan of Dune, and I really enjoyed reading some of the prequel books to learn more about the leaders, such as Prince Romba or Ilban Rachezi. Rise of Ix and Immortality are excellent expansions, and they provide everything you'd want from an expansion pack. They address some of the weaknesses of the base game, while adding more depth and variety to players who've already played lots of the base game. Sadly, good expansions are not always the case when it comes to board games, so it's worth noting that Rise of Ix and Immortality are excellent additions. Despite my absolute love of Dune Imperium, I do have some criticisms. The early game can be quite predictable and repetitive due to the overwhelming value of the shipping track and the Swordmaster. Every game sees the rush for smuggling, fold space, and interstellar shipping to get the Swordmaster as soon as possible. The Immortality expansion made shipping even stronger, as now it also provides the research bonus with experimentation cards. I was excited for Dreadnoughts in Rise of Ix to provide an alternative to Swordmaster rushing, but unfortunately it seems that Dreadnought rushing is rarely viable. Solari also feels poorly balanced. It's essential and difficult to obtain early game, but then becomes borderline useless late game once Swordmaster and High Council are required. It's nice that Immortality attempted to address this by providing a late game use for Solari on the research track, but this space is situational and not very common. The Swordmaster is definitely imbalanced compared to the High Council and Dreadnoughts. The latter are optional and not always acquired, but the Swordmaster is absolutely essential. Another issue I have with Dune Imperium is that often the cost of cards feels arbitrary. The value that cards provide varies so much, and it often isn't reflected in their price. As a result, there's too much luck based on which player can pick up a cheap overpowered card when they're revealed, such as In the Shadows or Web of Power. My problem isn't that some cards are overpowered. Having imbalanced cards can create excitement and tension to scramble for the best cards. Overpowered cards also encourage players to forgo their agent turns by revealing early and acquiring them before other players. My problem is that many of the best cards have trivial costs and can be acquired with little to no effort. Meanwhile, other cards such as Scout are worthless and serve only to stagnate the row. It can be very frustrating when you buy a mediocre card, only to then reveal Chome Delegate or Water Peddler for the next player, which they can afford despite only having one persuasion. To make matters worse, many of the best cards have duplicates, making their appearances common. The crazy value of the cheap, overpowered cards also encourages players to use their family atomics in the first round to reset the Imperium row, even if they only have a couple of persuasion, just in the hopes of high-rolling a cheap, overpowered card. This can cause the Imperium row to stagnate in later rounds, as often all 4 players will use their family atomics early. It would be better if there were less of the overpowered low-cost cards such as In the Shadows, and more overpowered high-cost cards such as Lady Jessica or Chome Directorship. Having more overpowered high-cost cards would also have the benefit of making High Council more appealing compared to Swordmaster. The flag mechanic is an interesting idea, but their impact on the game is underwhelming. Flags only provide minor bonuses, and are rarely seen since they're rewards for specific conflicts that may not even appear in the game. The combat rewards which give flags also already grant victory points, so the flags are usually just an afterthought. The flag mechanic could have been a much more interesting system if instead they were the only combat reward in certain conflict cards, but then granted much stronger bonuses. For example, what if only the player with a flag token for CH Tabur could visit this board space, instead of it requiring the 2 Fremen influence? Another missed opportunity with Dune Imperium is its inflexibility with different player counts. I often have a larger board gaming group, so unfortunately we can't play Dune Imperium as much as we'd like. We once played a homebrew 5-player variant of Dune Imperium, in which we introduced additional board spaces by combining the base game board with a Rise of Ix board. This was actually really fun, and it felt more balanced than we were expecting. So I wish there was an expansion or an official rule set to incorporate additional players, even if 4 players is considered the standard and the most balanced rule set. For example, Viticulture is a worker placement game, which has flexible player counts due to there being more or less board spaces depending on player sizes. I also don't think the 2-player version of the game is very good. I have played a lot of it and I do still enjoy it, but that's despite the fact that it's played with the House Hagal deck. The 2-player version of the game would be much better if the board and gameplay were modified rather than using the House Hagal deck of cards that perform random actions in an attempt to substitute a 3rd player. The pure randomness and lack of predictability can be very frustrating, especially in regards to combat. Dune Imperium combines worker placement, deck building, and player versus player combat for a unique mix that's greater than the sum of its parts. These three systems elegantly interact and don't feel disconnected. Combat is implemented spectacularly and mitigates potential frustration with voluntary participation in combat, rewards for second and third place, and all troops being lost at the end of a round. Games tend to feel close, dramatic, and exciting, as subtle anti-snowball mechanics make it difficult to take and hold a large point advantage. A match of Dune Imperium delivers a satisfying sense of progression and escalation as it ramps up in intensity during the later rounds. It has the perfect balance of luck and skill, with enough chaos to prevent the most experienced player from always winning, while delivering luck in a way that allows players to react. Dune Imperium has enormous replayability, due to the large amount of variation, content, and different paths to victory. It has an excellent balance of hidden versus public information to create tension without frustrating surprises. I love Dune Imperium's scoring, as each victory point feels like a gratifying milestone, and it makes planning for tiebreakers interesting and removes any complicated endgame scoring. Compared to many other Euro games, Dune Imperium is short, making it suitable for casual board game nights or playing quick games online. It also has an excellent visual design that helps make the game more intuitive to learn. It has 2 fantastic expansions that improve some of the weaknesses in the base game while adding more depth and variation to the game. However, I do have some criticisms, such as the predictable meta of shipping and swordmaster rushing, as well as the enormous power disparity of cards, especially the cheap, overpowered ones that require little to no investment. There's also some missed opportunities, such as the overall insignificance of territory flags and the lack of variance for 5 or 6 player games. The 2-player version might also be much better if it modified the game rather than trying to substitute a 3rd player with a deck of random cards. However, my issues with the game are minor, and they don't limit my ability to enjoy it. For all these reasons, I think Dune Imperium is the best board game, and I look forward to playing it dozens more times. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video interesting. Let me know in the comments, what do you like about Dune Imperium, and maybe what are some of your criticisms?